G'day, it's Jamie, and welcome to Where's My Yowie. Today, I'm reading an old newspaper article about a Bunyip story set on Cape York Peninsula, Queensland in 1899. So we'll get into it. This was published in the Clarence and Richmond Examiner on Saturday, the 9th of September, 1899, titled Devil, Devil of the Peninsula by Majuba. The great tract of Queensland soil, which ends in Cape York and is generally known as the Peninsula, was for many years looked upon with wistful eyes by the northern diggers. From the then unexplored wilderness came, from time to time, marvellous tales of mineral wealth which lay hidden in its black gorges and broken, sterile ranges of its aborigines, fierce and numerous, who wore ornaments fashioned from gold. All these cast over the peninsula a glamour which its unknown dangers only serve to heighten. In miners' tents on the Palmer, on overlanders' camps on the Flinders, and in the wool sheds of the Barcoo, the fables of Gascoigne the castaway and Burgess the pearl sheller went from hand to hand, losing no colour as they travelled. Gascoigne, as the story ran, was the only survivor of a cruise shipwrecked on Cape York. For many years he lived among the Aborigines, seeing no white men until he had almost forgotten his native tongue and became in all respects a native. He joined in the hunting parties, fought against the enemies of the tribe, and took a wife from among the dusky daughters of the soil. At length, a party of white men appeared on the coast, and the natives, led by Gascoigne, attacked them, and in the skirmish that followed, Gascoigne was mortally wounded. The whites, when they overhauled the dead and dying, discovered that he was of their own colour and endeavoured by all possible means to alleviate the pain of his last moments. The dying man related in broken English the history of his life, and then went on to tell of much gold cached in the camp in the hills. But before he described its situation, death sealed his lips. Following up the trail of the defeated Aborigines, the white men tried by every means to find the treasure. Their efforts were futile, and the secret lay buried with the renegade who had died fighting against the men of his own colour. Traces of gold appeared wherever they turned up the soil, but they could find nothing which, at a time when 1 ounce to the bucket was reported elsewhere, they considered good enough to repay their labour. Alarmed by the attitude of the natives, who returned in great numbers, and dismayed by the roughness of the country, they retired, intending to return later, better equipped for the search. Burgess the pearl sheller was credited less truthfully, for there was some foundation for the last story with no more successful efforts. Making a descent on the coast in his cutter, he had taken from the natives by force their ornaments of gold, and furthermore had obtained from them the secret of their wealth. With his cutter laden deep, he sailed from the coast. When 12 hours out, a great storm with contrary winds arose, and Burgess, his little craft wallowing deep in the seas, was forced to put about and try to regain his anchorage under the lee of the cape. He failed to weather the promontory, and the cutter was cast with all hands upon the eastern shore. The Aborigines appeared in strong force, and in revenge for what they had suffered, killed the naked and helpless crew. Bushmen are credulous and enthusiastic to a greater degree than any other class, unless perhaps sailors. In the mind of the digger, the wish is father to the fort, and tales of such as these cause the thought of many to turn to this El Dorado of the North. But the great rush to the Kimberley, breaking out just then, turned the fickle attention of the nomads in another direction. The Kimberley, like other fields of promise, proved disappointing, and in less than 2 years the stampede of retreating diggers commenced. Derelict drays, harness and outfits lined the roads, abandoned as encumbrances by the horseless prospectors, for the soil, devoid of grass, produced many poisonous herbs, and a disease had broken out which carried the horses off by scores. Among these disappointed prospectors, 3 mates, a strangely assorted trio, returned to Melbourne disheartened by failure and uncertain which way to turn their steps. Levitt, the leader of the party, was a Sydney-sider, tall, narrow-shouldered and leggy, simple in appearance but in reality shrewd, an excellent bushman. McAllister, Mac, the second, was a Scot, short, thick-set and muscular. The third was a German, Jacobs by name, but nicknamed by his companions Bismarck. Small, spare, and very wiry, he was well fitted for the life, save in one respect. Take Bismarck into the scrub, said Levitt, and turn him around 3 times and leave him, and he's lost. In spite of this drawback, his never-failing good humour and resourcefulness under difficulty rendered him a good campmate. Sufficient means still remained among them to obtain outfit suitable for 6 months' prospecting trip, and they cared not to linger in town long, where a bushman's gold melts like loam in a digger's cradle. Chance determined them. Jacobs, in going over to the Melbourne hospital, had found a fellow countryman, Schmidt by name, who had recently returned from the Peninsula suffering from fever, so ill indeed that his recovery was pronounced impossible. He described the place with bitterness, it is true, but in colours heightened by the longings of a baffled fortune seeker. Gold, he said, would be found there plentiful now that the natives were sufficiently quiet to allow miners to work unmolested, and for this boon the diggers might thank the Kanaka pearl shellers from the islands off the coast. These men, when at liberty, came to the mainland with their trade rifles hunting. The natives resented this encroachment on their land, cut off and speared stragglers from time to time. Sinking their tribal differences, the pearl shellers crossed a body to revenge the death of their comrades. Better armed than the Aborigines, they slaughtered them wholesale and so terrified the remainder that they were afraid to meet them. Thenceforward, the fishers went regularly to the mainland, ostensibly to hunt kangaroo, but in reality to gratify their lust for blood, until the panic-stricken and demoralised natives deserted the coast and fled far inland. To Jacobs, his countryman Schmidt bequeathed the legacy of his experiences, with such details and descriptions as would enable him to reap the benefit of a dying man's discoveries. Bismarck's enthusiasm spread to his companions, and they determined to tempt fortune once more on this new field. Bidding adieu to Melbourne, they took a boat for the north, and in Cooktown, finding a pearling schooner about to start for her destination in Cambridge Gulf, they bargained with her skipper to land them with their horses, a dray and outfit on the coast of the Cape. The northern part of the promontory is hilly, the valleys well clothed with grass, and at the coast cattle station, for there was a cattle station lately formed on the Cape, they obtained a supply of beef and then started southward to find a Smith's prospecting ground. many days of wearying travelling, sometimes going far out of their straight course to round some great salt swamp, sometimes having to camp and make a crossing over a treacherous creek, brought them at length to the Camel's Humps, twin peak hills described by Smith as the Orpheus Field. Before them lay a great, shallow freshwater swamp. A sea of weaving reeds stretched as far as the eye could reach. Behind them the peaks, clothed with scrub to their very summit. The scene, desolate and wild, caused their hearts to sink, for it looked barren and unlikely from a digger's point of view. They unloaded and fixed their camp at the foot of the hills, some distance from the water. While thus occupied, an Aboriginal man and 2 women appeared on the hillside, and after making friendly signs, the man approached. Levitt, upon questioning him, found that he could understand him, for it is a curious fact that the Peninsula Aborigines, those so widely sundered, spoke a language almost identical with that used by the natives of the Lachlan River in New South Wales. The man told him that a great devil had taken possession of the swamp, and that it was unsafe for anyone to remain long near it. Nervously scanning the water, he returned to his companions, and all 3 disappeared into the scrub which clothed the hillside. "The old doited devil," said Mac. "I've heard of spooks and boogies at home, but in Australia I thought there was nae such thing." "Did you ever hear tell of the Bunyip?" said Levitt. "The Aborigines all over the country talk of bunyips and devils what camps in the water, and on the Murrumbidgee. I once seen her in my country," broke in Bismarck. "There is, in mountains like these, the great monstrous image. Dog follows the hunter, and mimics their actions." "Gammon," replied Levitt. "As I was saying, these here bunyips is all bunkum, and barring the freshwater seals we sometimes sees in the Bidgie and other creeks, there's no such thing. So look alive, boys, and get things fixed before nightfall. We've little time for yarning, for once the sun goes down in these parts, it soon gets dark." Night closed in with a thinly clouded sky, through which the watery beams of the moon filtered, casting a dim light. The men, with loaded rifles standing handy, sat round the firelight, talking over old experiences and discussing their future chance of luck. From the swamp came the voices of the bush, the bell-like note of the frogs, the chatter of feeding waterfowl, and the musical call of distant swans. And above these, and seeming to silence all when it arose, came at intervals a hoarse, booming sound, increasing in volume at every repetition. "Yon's what they call a button," said Mac, drawing lazily at his pipe. "Putter," said Bismarck with a chuckle. "Py crikey, den, I wish he come a leetle closer. I no like. He'd tied pred so long. I wish he came closer, so I lay my hand on him. Button, you gomerel. No butter, there's no cows in this pet." Levitt rose and looked towards the swamp. "Bismarck's not for wrong after all," he said. "If it's not a cow, it's a bull. Strange that the station cattle should stray so far." The sound continued, gradually drawing nearer, and now Levitt became uncertain what to make of it. It was some large creature, that was certain, but he had not broken the faltering cadence, ending in falsetto, of a bull's roar. It continued in one long boom, without interruption or change. And what would a bull be doing on that great waste of water? "Let's go to the swamp head," said Mac, "and see what we can make of it." "Better stay where you are," said Levitt. "Leave the bloomin' thing alone. Let him sing if it amuses him. Let him go to his little bed." As if agreeing with this last remark, the creature gave one great roar, ending with a whistling snort, and then the sounds grew gradually fainter until they ceased entirely. Bismarck, who had stretched himself upon the ground with ear close to the surface, declared that he could hear splashing of some heavy body in the water and the crash of breaking reeds. But Levitt thought he was mistaken, for the cause of the sound, whatever it was, had never approached very close to the swamp edge. At the length the men tried out and turned in. Sunrise found them astir and ready to start an expedition among the hills, to look for a likely spot on which to commence operations. The soil was light, the herbage coarse speargrass, silvergrass, and a small species of saltbush which bore a cherry-coloured transparent berry. During the ramble they came upon an Aboriginal camp, occupied only by women and children, and so busy were they in gashing their bodies and mourning that they allowed the white men to enter the camp unnoticed. When at last they realised their presence and bolted into the scrub and disappeared like magic. Levitt drew out from one of the humpies an old woman, too old to run, who was trying to hide behind some grass mats. From her he ascertained the cause of the outcry. A man had been killed by the devil of the swamp. The woman showed the body. It had a deep gash across the abdomen, which had baffled all the skill of the medicine men, clever as they are at healing the wounds. Levitt tried to obtain a description of the creature that had caused the wound, but all he could gather from the reply was that it was of great size and possessed a tusk or horn, with which it struck its victims. At length, wondering at this confirmation of the medicine man's statement, and tired and dispirited, they returned to camp. Again they gathered round the firelight, discussing the tragedy of the Aboriginals' camp. Bismarck had broken one of his boots on the rocky hillside, and on his return he removed them, putting on a lighter pair. He now brought the boots from the tent, and leaving one near the fire, began to cobble the other. Overhead, the moon looked down from a cloudless sky. Attracted by the firelight, a wild dog prowled round the outskirts of the tent, eager to seize any bones or offal which might lie within its reach. He crept up, unnoticed, and carried off the unbroken boot. Bismarck caught sight of him as he was making off. Fleeing the remaining boot at the dog, he jumped to his feet and ran out of the camp in chase, amid the laughter of his companions. The dog retained his prize and made off along the foot of a hill, the German after him, yelling and cursing in broken English, determined to recover the boot. He kept on until he could no longer follow. Then, exhausted and angry, he turned and retraced his steps as he thought towards the camp. The fire was long in coming to view. Surely he had ran farther than he thought in chase of the dog. He found himself among unfamiliar surroundings, and then it flashed across him that the old misfortune had occurred was bushed once more. He determined to make his way to the edge of the swamp and follow it to where he could see the light of the fire. This was easily done, for the cry of the waterfowl was plainly heard above the singing of wind in the trees, and shortly he reached the water's edge. He drew back startled. From the swamp came a heavy splashing sound and the crash of broken reeds. Some large animal was moving through the water. The ground was open, straggling shrubs being the only cover, and these, in the bright moonlight, afforded but kept scanty screen for a man's body. Into these Bismarck crept and squatted down, for curiosity to see the cause of the sounds overcame the impulse to run. The reeds before him parted, and a great, dark, slimy body dragged itself from the ooze and stood on the swamp bank, sniffing the air. Horror overcame the little German, and he inwardly cursed the dog, the boot, and his own folly in leaving the camp. The animal stood still, its wet, hairless hide glistening in the rays of the moon. As large as a 3-year-old steer, but standing on shorter legs, its long, dusky carcass terminated in an enormous head from which 2 wide, white horns sloped downwards and backwards and finally rose in sharp points above its shoulders. It stood on the bank, sniffing loudly. Its little vicious pig eyes roamed round and finally fixed themselves on the form of the unlucky German. Then, raising its snout high in the air, it gave vent to the deep, booming roar which had so puzzled the 3 miners. All prudence vanished from the Bismarck's mind, and springing to his feet, he raced away for the shelter of the forest. Before half the distance was covered, a heavy trampling and snorting behind him told him that he was being pursued. Glancing back as he ran, he saw the beast approaching at an awkward, rolling gallop with lowered head. Though already gasping for breath from the efforts he had made, Bismarck made a desperate spurt for an immense tree which towered above the scrub before him. The closeness of his pursuer and the formation of the tree forbade a direct attempt to climb, but he dodged behind the shelter of the trunk. The impetus of the gallop carried the animal beyond him. The foam from its nostrils sprayed his clothes as it brushed past, but the beast soon came to a standstill and returned viciously to attack. Again the German dodged round the tree, and now began a game of catch who, catch can between the two. Round and round they went, the great lumbering beast now nearly upon his victim, missing him only by a hand's breadth from the blind impetuosity of its attack. Bismarck's trembling limbs could scarcely carry him, for the tension and nerve and sense was great. He dared not keep too far in advance for fear that the beast, evidently a most cunning one, should turn and meet him. And this was what at last brought the game to a close. Too blind and dazed to watch his pursuer closely, Bismarck suddenly found himself face to face with the animal, for the latter had taken the very course the German dreaded. He tried to grasp it by the horns, but falling, fell right onto the lowered head. Next moment he was whirled aloft, high into the air. The great fig tree of northern Queensland grows always along the foot of rocky ridges, with a straight, branchless shaft for some distance from the ground. It is a difficult tree for a hurried man to climb, but when, once among its horizontal limbs, the climber finds no difficulty in making his way. It was a very large tree of this kind, round which Bismarck had been dodging the devil, and as he descended from his aerial flight, he came in contact with the lowest of its branches, which, catching him across the middle, held him suspended with head and feet dangling towards the ground. It did not take long to attain a more comfortable position, for he was unhurt, save some bruises and a loss of wind. He was now out of reach of the animal and safe for present. Moving to a higher branch, he took a seat against the trunk of the tree, from whence he could watch the animal below and consider his own future course of action. The beast did not leave, as he expected, now that his victim was beyond his reach, but, moving around the foot of the tree, kept looking up with twinkling, vicious eyes and giving vent at intervals to its deafening roar. From the distant camp came the sound of signal shots. His mates, concluding him bushed, were firing to let him know which way to travel. Night, to one in an uncomfortable and precarious position, seems interminable, but the long hours came to an end at last. The animal had never strayed far from the foot of the tree, always returning when Bismarck made any movement. It seemed to know that he must sometime be again within reach of those terrible horns. Anxiety for the safety of his mates filled Bismarck's mind, and he knew that they would follow his tracks at daybreak, and he feared they might come unprepared to meet the attack. He climbed to the highest point he could reach, hoping to be able to give them a timely warning. As daylight broadened, the animal became restless and uneasy, and moved from side to side with ears twitching nervously. Once it appeared to have concluded to return to its feeding ground and moved off for some distance, but a movement from the German brought it back at a trot to the foot of the tree, where it took up its position, silent and watchful. Suddenly the animal raised its head and looked quickly round, flicking its sides with its tail as if it had caught some sound which the dull ears of a man above could not catch. Bismarck moved on his perch and strained his eyes to catch any signs of his comrade's approach, but no sound or movement came from the scrub. His movement attracted the animal's attention, and it turned its head to watch him. With a whistle and a crash, a shower of spears came flying across from the encircled bushes and buried themselves in the carcass of the animal. The great beast lurched forward onto its knees, recovered its feet, and again for a moment, and then fell flat on its side, struggling in the throes of death. Out of the bushes on every side, as mysteriously as if ridden from the earth, came a score of stalwart Aborigines, shooting and brandishing spears with every sign of joy. They gathered round the dying animal, all talking together in excited guttural tones. Their mutual congratulations were disturbed by the arrival of Levitt and Mac. Levitt, astonished at the sight of the Aborigines, the dead carcass, and now Bismarck scrambling down from his perch, was eager for an explanation, which he soon received. The natives had started early that morning on a hunting expedition along the edge of the swamp. Coming up upon the tracks of the devil, they had followed them up, and, with the wonderful noiselessness for which all Aboriginals are famed, they surrounded the animal without attracting the attention of either it or the German. As for the devil, Levitt, when he had examined it closely, explained with bursts of laughter what it was. Sometime during the last century, a Dutch expedition landed on the coast of Port Essington with the intention of forming a settlement. Among other animals, they brought with them a number of swamp buffalo, and these, when the settlement was abandoned, were left on the coast. The country around the port is low and swampy, and admirably suited to the buffalo. They increased so rapidly that at length they roamed the swamp in great herds. Stragglers from these herds have from time to time wandered inland and along the coast, odd ones having been seen as far south as the head of the Flinders River. These wanderers, being bulls hunted from the herd by others, are generally very vicious and cunning, and if molested, will attack the hunter with determined ferocity. Great numbers have been shot amongst the swamps of Port Essington for their hides and horns. The horns sometimes attain great size, and it is no uncommon thing to find a bull whose horns measure over 7 feet in the sweep of their semicircle from tip to tip. Thus ended the depredations of the devil, which had long held in terror of the Aborigines of the Peninsula, for they had never before obtained a fair chance to turn the tables on the vicious and cunning beast. The 3 prospectors had no luck in their labours on the Cape, but a strange incident in another direction brought fortune within their grasp. But that is another story. The end. Well, I really like that story. That was written by Majuba, who wrote another story I did called The Burunji Walla, and I've got another story coming by him down the track where Mac, Levitt and Bismarck return in a story called The Man-Eaters of the Peninsula. Okay, that's it for me. I'll get back to you all next time. Bye.